Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking an absolutely pivotal, honestly kind of terrifying moment in modern history. We're going to break down the sheer scale of the 2026 US-Iran maritime conflict. The clashes that practically derailed global shipping and security overnight. But even more crucially, we're going to dive into the incredibly ambitious, yet totally fragile diplomatic deal that tried to just stop it dead in its tracks, the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding. To really wrap our heads around the gravity of this conflict, we've got to start with one staggering number: 104. That's the number of lives lost when the U.S. Navy submarine USS Charlotte torpedoed the Iranian frigate IRS Dina. And I want to pause here because this wasn't just a tragic skirmish. This was a massive historical threshold being crossed. It was literally the very first time a United States submarine sank an enemy surface vessel since World War II. It was a massive wake-up call that this was a full-blown, lethal maritime war. Part 1. The 2026 Maritime Chaos. So how fast did things unravel? Well, the Gulf of Oman, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Persian Gulf all basically descended into utter chaos in a matter of weeks. It started on March 1st with strikes on Shadow Fleet vessels, like the oil tanker Skylight in Oman. Literally 3 days later, bam, the historic sinking of the IRS Dana by the U.S. By May, things had escalated to the point of direct vessel seizures, like Iranian forces boarding and taking the floating armory Huichuan. The sheer volume and intensity of these attacks through the spring was so extreme that it practically forced everyone to the negotiating table, eventually giving us the diplomatic draft of the Islamabad MOU on June 17th. But who was actually getting caught in this crossfire? The toll was completely indiscriminate. This wasn't just military on military action. We saw commercial vessels like the Safe and Prestige left burning and adrift, completely abandoned by their crews. And on the flip side, advanced military warships like the Iranian frigate Iris Jamaran were being struck and sunk right in their own ports by the U.S. From cargo ships disabled by Hellfire missiles to oil tankers like the MKD Viam catching fire and losing crew members. Basically, if you were trying to navigate these waters, you were in extreme danger. Part 2. Enforcing the naval blockade. As the conflict hit a boiling point, the U.S. launched Operation Project Freedom, which was essentially a sweeping naval blockade aimed at completely choking off Iranian shipping. Now, to enforce a blockade of this massive scale, the U.S. military used a highly surgical approach. They weren't just out there wildly blowing ships out of the water. The protocol usually went like this. First, repeated radio warnings over a 24-hour period. But if a ship ignored those warnings, the U.S. brought in FA-18 Super Hornets with incredibly precise munitions. For example, on tankers like the Lexi and the Halvier, they systematically fired Hellfire missiles right into the engine rooms, or they used 5-inch naval rounds specifically to take out the steering capabilities. The whole idea was to completely disable the vessels, just stop them from reaching port, rather than sinking them to the bottom of the ocean. And for the really tricky situations, they'd send in elements like the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit for direct physical boardings. Part 3. The Islamabad Memorandum. By the time summer rolled around, the immense military pressure and the sheer economic devastation had just become totally unsustainable for everyone involved. That's what forced this massive diplomatic push on June 17, 2026. The resulting draft featured a sweeping, honestly kind of unprecedented exchange. On one side, the U.S. agreed to completely lift its crippling naval blockade within 30 days, alongside terminating all unilateral and UN sanctions, and unfreezing Iranian assets. Huge concessions, right? In return, Iran agreed to permanently terminate military operations on all fronts, take active measures to keep commercial ships safe in the vital Strait of Hormuz, and crucially, definitively halt the procurement and development of nuclear weapons. But what's really fascinating is that the scope of this agreement went way beyond just the waters of the Middle East. It wasn't just about the blockade or the Persian Gulf. Both sides explicitly agreed to an immediate termination of military operations on all fronts. And they specifically named the intense fighting and airstrikes happening throughout Lebanon, officially committing to ensure Lebanon's territorial integrity. It was very clearly designed to pull the entire region back from the brink of total war. Part 4. Nuclear limits and reconstruction. Of course, stopping the bullets, the missiles, and the torpedoes is really only half the battle, right? To get any kind of lasting peace, negotiators had to tackle the elephant in the room: economics and nuclear enrichment. As part of this draft, the U.S. and its regional partners committed to a staggering financial lifeline. We're talking a $300 billion plan for the reconstruction and economic development of Iran, all pending a finalized deal. $300 billion. Let that sink in. But as you might expect, that massive financial lifeline came with some incredibly strict strings attached. The draft mandated severe nuclear limits. It explicitly required Iran to resolve its stockpiled enriched material. And the method? Mandatory on-site downblending of that material, all happening under the direct, watchful eye of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, all of these moving parts were squeezed into a highly compressed timeline. These negotiators were literally racing against the clock. Immediately upon signing, the U.S. had to start lifting the naval blockade. Within 30 days, that blockade had to be completely gone and commercial traffic fully restored. And the absolute craziest part? They gave themselves a maximum of just 60 days to take this incredibly fragile ceasefire draft and transform it into a permanent, legally binding UN Security Council resolution. 60 days for all of that. Part 5. A fraying ceasefire. You know, diplomacy written on a piece of paper in a quiet room often clashes violently with the reality out on the water. So the central question for this explainer is simply, can an agreement born out of this level of widespread violence actually hold? When you have 104 sailors dying in a single strike and massive warships being sunk in port, can the ink even dry on a 60-day deadline before the shooting starts all over again? Especially given the very latest reports we're seeing. Recent headlines are already painting a pretty grim picture. Outlets like Al Monitor are directly asking why the ceasefire memorandum has frayed. And when you see that kind of framing, it strongly implies that the immense level of trust required by both parties to successfully execute a tight 60-day timeline is rapidly evaporating. And then we get reports from KPBS basically confirming our worst fears. Military force has officially returned to the Gulf. We're seeing a brand new wave of U.S. strikes hitting tankers that are still actively trying to run the blockade. It suggests that the fundamental core of the ceasefire is just straight up failing to hold on the open water. So ultimately, this leaves us with a pretty stark reality check. With commercial ships still actively being targeted and the ceasefire visibly unraveling right in front of us, we really have to wonder, is the Islamabad MOU destined to be remembered as this historic turning point that finally brought peace to the Middle East? Or is it just going to be a brief 60-day pause in one of the most devastating maritime wars of the 21st century? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it helped you map out exactly what is at stake out there on the water.